let's all remain on mute while the presenter does each one of the sessions. So, without further ado, I leave you with Dustin Fry.
Wonderful. So first, I guess thank you to Gustavo for putting together a great session, and in advance to Randy for the feedback. We're excited. So the paper I'm going to present today is part of an agenda that Nick and I have been working on for the last couple of years. And the broader agenda focuses on the immediate long-run effects of self-governance on American Indian reservations. You'll notice from the program, we have a little bit of a title change. I think as this particular paper has taken shape, and part of our motivation for this paper comes from the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which emphasizes the importance of self-governance. And so it's against this backdrop that we're going to try to empirically, contribute to this question of whether or not self-determination is beneficial for economic development. And so on one side of this literature, we can kind of see this first set of citations, with North and others, that recognizes the importance of local accountability and adaptability for growth. Whereas kind of on the other side, as pointed out in Barden's JEL, he highlights that local governance may lack the capacity to kind of adequately meet the local needs. You can imagine, public infrastructure or public good needs, or provide the kind of institutional credibility necessary for development. And so it's in this place that we want to contribute empirically in a setting that focuses on the formation of modern tribal governments, where we're going to find variation in the extent to which tribal governments were allowed to govern themselves. So our goal here is to kind of leverage that variation to understand the long-term consequences of self-governance for growth. So specifically, we're going to focus on the Indian Reorganization Act, which was passed by Congress in the mid-1930s. And I think to understand kind of the full effect of the IRA, it's actually helpful to take a step back. So following the formation of reservations, the forced removal of American Indians, federal Indian policy really focused on cultural assimilation. And that happened primarily through two channels. So first, on the education side with mission schools, boarding schools, day schools, and then second through really the Dawes Act and the assignment of private property. And it was connected to this second piece, or the second channel. There was an emphasis on undermining, traditional tribal governance. By breaking up the reservation, part of what they were trying to accomplish is to break up kind of this tribal government. But it was in the late 1920s that the Merriam Commission really reports on the extent of reservation poverty, and really highlighted the government's failure to fulfill its obligations. And this starts to initiate some change in the direction of federal policy, so that by Roosevelt's election in 32, part of what's instituted is a new head of the Office of Indian Affairs, John Collier, and he was much more committed than his predecessors to kind of recognizing tribal governments and to increasing tribal sovereignty. And so specifically with the IRA itself, it introduces a couple measures. And so the first major measure, which applied to every reservation, is that it halted the issuance of new land patents, really stopping the allotment process. And some of what Collier's vision was, which wasn't fully implemented, I think, to the early drafts, was to kind of reestablish tribal governments. And there were a few pieces within the bill itself, some of which were aided in writing constitutions and business charters. There was also the establishment of a revolving credit fund, somewhat for business development, project development, restoring the land base. So there were a few different ingredients as part of this bill itself. One of the characteristics that distinguishes the IRA from most other federal Indian policy is that it was not universally applied. And so tribes actually held elections on whether or not to organize under the IRA kind of within 18 months of that kind of 1934 passage. And it was actually during this window that the Office of Indian Affairs held a bunch of informational congresses, primarily focused on answering questions about the IRA, because there was actually a lot of uncertainty at the time regarding the division of power between really between tribal governments and the federal government, and how they were going to kind of divide sort of the decision-making authority over different functions and parts of kind of reservation business. So another important feature of the IRA is that the election result was irreversible. And in some cases, there were concerns about election integrity, about vote counting, but there was never an opportunity for a revote. There was never an opportunity to contest this result. Once the IRA passed and the government tallied its votes, that it was decided. And so we're actually going to take voting results from a follow-up report from the 1940s, which is this Haas reference in the slide. And it shows that roughly 2/3 of tribes were organized under the IRA. And so where these 217 tribes are located, we went ahead and plotted these reservation centroids across the US, and with the solid dots being the location of IRA organized reservations, and the kind of gray X's being these non-IRA reservations. And there's a reasonable spatial distribution, certainly with a little bit of clustering up where I'm located in New York. We can see mostly non-IRA reservations. In the Southwest, particularly Arizona, New Mexico, far more IRA reservations. But even in some cases, you see neighbors. Where I'm from, in Eastern Montana, the Northern Cheyenne opted to organize under the IRA, and the neighboring Crow did not. And so this kind of gives us a sense of kind of all the locations that we potentially observe, and kind of their spatial distribution. And so, despite Collier's maybe initial intent, one of the things we see once the IRA actually goes into practice is that it really created a form of limited sovereignty. And there's a couple reasons for that play out once we kind of get on the other side of the 1930s. And kind of a major feature of that, and a particularly binding section, involved any deals involving land or natural resources. Because any transactions involving, say, things like trust lands, leasing decisions, kind of land developments broadly defined, required the approval of the Secretary of Interior, and then therefore sort of included the Office of Indian Affairs, or eventually the BIA, as part of that process. And then on kind of a second piece, involved the credit fund. Right, and really for a lot of the kind of credit allocation, we have, of course, this issue where not all of the credit that was promised ultimately was delivered. And keeping in mind, this was a really attractive part of organizing under the IRA, was access to this credit. We're kind of in the midst of the Great Depression. And so these funds, I think tribes are really hoping and looking forward to being able to use these to restore the land base and kind of revitalize sort of their kind of tribal areas. And unfortunately, it wasn't delivered. And even in the cases where funding was approved, there was quite a bit of close supervision from BIA officials that were really, as we kind of have read about this anecdotally, we're looking to kind of minimize losses. And in going through kind of the anecdotes and the stories that came out of kind of this period in the 40s and 50s, there's lots of accounts highlighting really the BIA's, kind of direct involvement in tribal government, right? And so we have these stories about how they viewed some of these tribal governments and how involved they really were. And so, this kind of IRA structure is set in contrast to the non-IRA reservations, which were allowed to develop their own governance structures and were given a little bit more autonomy. And so in this paper, we're going to focus on a pretty simple comparison between IRA and non-IRA reservations. Our outcome of interest is going to be per capita income, exclusively for Native Americans, coming from kind of the most recent ACS sample centered around 2016, and then the 1980 census. for this specification, we're going to include a base set of controls and some population sample conditions from Anderson and Parker. In some specifications, we include a control for 1938 per capita income, which was collected from the National Archives. We're going to estimate this using standard errors from Conley, allowing for some spatial correlation out to 100 miles. And then one of the features we explore a little bit is a kind of what we call our full sample, and then a trimmed sample of narrowly determined elections. And we're going to just borrow from the regression discontinuity literature on what we classify as a narrowly determined election. And so just to give a brief summary for these results, when we look in 2016, or what we call 2016, income per capita is about 12% lower on IRA reservations. And this is true for what ends up being kind of our full sample of 113 reservations. And it's maybe slightly larger, but very similar for the trimmed sample of what we're classifying as narrowly determined elections. What's interesting is when we then look back at 1980 income per capita, we see a slightly larger difference where income per capita is about 15% lower on IRA reservations. And so remember that these IRA reservations are the ones where we feel there was a little bit of a kind of, limited self-governance applied in these situations. And one of the things we find or that we think is happening here is that most of the modern discrepancy is really driven by these pre-1980 differences, that a lot of what we see in this separation occurs in those first 3 to 4 decades after the IRA passes. Okay. So kind of, I know this is sort of a very quick broad stroke of the paper. And I think one of the things that we're taking away from this is in support of that UN declaration, where we're finding, increased self-determination is associated with positive long-run differences. And I think for us with this kind of broader project, a lot of what we want to focus on going forward, and the frontier for this paper, is unpacking these mechanisms, really trying to understand what's happening in those, in those 4 decades, and how have tribal governments adjusted with, say, the increased self-determination acts from the 70s, in the more recent periods. And so I've kind of highlighted on this slide a handful of these kind of the frontiers that we're interested in. We've collected, information on BIA projects from news releases, the full set of credit reports. We've charted out kind of the constitutions, business charters, many of the things that the IRA was involved with. And this kind of really sets the table for where we want to go with this paper. So I think I'm out of time, and so we're gonna stop there.
Thank you very much, Dustin. Randy, please go ahead.
So hang on just a second. Let me share my screen. And can everybody see this? Are we good? So thanks everyone for organizing this, Gustavo, and thanks for allowing me to read this really interesting paper. It's a topic that's close to my heart and many people who have done work on this area. So I think it's great to see the work that you guys are doing on this. And so the basic question is, does adoption of the IRA have a long-run effect on per capita income for tribal reservation residents? It's clearly a very interesting question. We think about this internationally in development and in sort of the political economy literature. In the US, it's thought of less frequently, but of course, individuals, people doing research in indigenous communities have thought of this. And so, it's a very important area of research. And, I think, one of the novel contributions of this paper is this addition of this 1938 historical data on income, which most of us didn't know existed. So, kudos to you guys for including that. I think that's quite important. And the findings are that adoption of the IRA type constitutions reduced economic conditions relative to tribes that didn't adopt them, even decades later, and it's a persistent thing, and that's the part that's really, really interesting. I think between the last slide that Dustin just showed was, in 1980, there's a 15% difference and negative difference for IRA adopting tribes, and even in 2016, it's still 12%. And I thought the other very interesting part was that there is a larger variance for the non-IRA constitution tribes. While they are doing better, there may have not been as much of a safety net. They don't call it that, but in some sense, that seems like the case. So again, really interesting results that I don't think we had considered prior to this. I know the paper is short and I know the presentation was short, but my suggestion would be that these narrow election results that you guys have on these sort of narrowly decided, I'm not sure that it really satisfies the regression discontinuity type situation. Because my reading of the historical literature is that these votes may have been, coerced by the Indian agents specifically. So, the reflection is not political preferences, but the concerted efforts of one side or the other. So I think, clearly you couldn't address that in the paper, given the length, but, I think if you want to go down that route, you'd really have to do a lot more effort to, examine sort of those votes. And again, my reading of it is that there's some evidence that that the Indian agents, were encouraging this. I don't think you need it. I thought, the results hold up without it. I think it adds extra things to it, but I don't think it satisfies it in the way economists would want it to be, unfortunately. So that's the first thing. And then again, I know you don't have space in the paper and didn't have time in the presentation, but articulating who is being measured in the 2016 ACS, and it really matters. And I know you guys know this. Is it American Indian, Alaska Native alone? Is it alone in combination with other races? Is it the AIN population and non-AIN population residing on the reservation, right? So that's number one, because those three categories can be wildly different in terms of per capita income. Relatedly, how do the modern definitions that you're using in the 2016 align with the 1938 data? Specifically, who are they measuring? Are they measuring American Indians, Alaska Natives? Probably, I think, and probably excluding the non-natives residing on reservations, right? And there were non-natives even back then, right? There were school teachers, there were Indian agents, and there were other sort of settlers as well. And then, even if that, those alignments work, whether they work or not, I mean, just articulating them matters. But how was that data collected? Was it done by surveys, reservation to reservation, or was the Indian agent responsible for recording that data? And I say this because, our experience, all of our experiences using some data from the Bureau of Indian Affairs has been shown to have, severe flaws, right? Even in recent decades, where missing information is often treated as zero, right? Coded specifically as zero, not as missing. So there are systematic issues potentially in the way in which data has been collected and reported, unfortunately. And then finally, do the geographic units that you're using from 1938 align with the modern assignment of reservations? Are they approximately similar? There have been changes, but maybe it's a minor thing. And then finally, the last point is, the 71 tribes that you identify in the 1938 data, are they more or less likely to have adopted an IRA constitution? And that's something you can definitely test for, right? And let us know. And then, so ultimately, I want to, sort of push you guys to start telling us, more about how you think about the counterfactual in this case. Is the comparison group all non-IRA tribes with a written constitution, or is it all tribes regardless of whether they have written constitutions in the US? And again, for example, some tribes are theocracies, nothing written, right? Purely sort of religious leaders. And some operate without a constitution, and the best known is obviously the Navajo Nation. So a minor issue is that in the text, you never say that it's your outcome variables log of inflation per capita income. You say it in the tables, but not in the text. So that's just a very minor thing. And I didn't think the map was super helpful because, it's small and the observations are sort of mostly clustered. And so I was thinking, I know what you were trying to get at, trying to show the difference between the adoption of IRA and non-IRA, and maybe a histogram would work better. That's just a short, thought on that. And so, again, the conclusions are the tribes with IRA constitutions have lower per capita income. They align with the story that IRA tribes have more oversight by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and this extra bureaucracy creates potential delays. And, there's this really interesting novel historical data for 1938. So, I think it's really, really promising. I think there's, I'm really excited to see what you guys do, especially in explaining that 40-year difference, persistence between 1980 and 2016. Really great stuff.
Randy, thank you very much for this discussion. Dustin, would you like to take some minutes to respond to Randy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, Randy, thank you so much. I think this is, in some ways, I think it confirms some of our leanings. I mean, we had definitely, the concerns about the election itself, I think is something that we've really wrestled with. Like, how do we think about this? And it's, I think you're exactly right. It's the area, I think, in a more full paper that we will absolutely get into and really try to understand. And for this one, we'll definitely kind of think about sort of how do we discuss it, how do we use it, whether it's even necessary at all. Because I think we certainly have enough in this that we, even without it. And we actually have footnotes in there about specifying our sample a little more cleanly that in reviewing and prepping the presentation, I realized, we hadn't actually filled in where it says, fill this section in right now. For us, we do focus on single race, self-identified Native Americans in 1980 and then 2016 exclusively. So that basically makes up the sample. And some of that is the 38 data is also exclusively for Native Americans. It was collected by the BIA. And we kind of felt like that was maybe the closest comparison. One idea I'd had that I think we can do in terms of checking on that 38 data is we can compare it to the 1940 full count data. Because we have wage and salary, I think it's wage and salary income in the full count. So that would actually give us that ability to just kind of see, it's a different measure, but it would at least maybe be a little bit insightful in terms of how we think about these two alternative measures taken from at least a similar point in time to help us understand that a little bit. And so, I don't want to take all the time with this, but thank you. That was really helpful. I guess to Marco's question in the chat, we actually do look at population, and one of the things, we don't find any difference in population as an outcome, because we were kind of wondering, I suppose, like all labor economists, about selective migration and things like this. And so there may be some of that, but we don't see that come out through just sort of population counts.
Great, thank you very much. I have a follow-up question. There are some parallels to what the BIA and the federal government did with through this IRA Act, related to what it did with the non-incorporated territories in the first half of the 20th century. So, the tutelage policies in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, for example, which were similar and to a certain extent even probably more restrictive of what these state territorial governments could do. I wonder if there's something that we can learn about these particular micro experiences and see what implications there may be for these broader populations.
Yeah, that's really useful. Yeah, that will be interesting to look at.
Members of attendees, if you would like to post questions on the Q&A, we'd be happy to to field them as well as we move ahead. So
Yeah, so Brian had just asked one about interactions between the experience with DAWs. I mean, in the ways we've started looking at it in the broader project, I mean, one of the things we were interested in is, really trying to see how does it affect, maybe the opt-in for the IRA, knowing that the credit was available partially to help restore that land base. Do we see, reservations that were, more negatively affected either by, surplus transfers or land cessions, where that land base may be eroded from tribal ownership. Are they more likely to make, different decisions? And then how does that play out over the longer time period? I mean, when we've looked at this in some preliminary stuff, we do find IRA reservations do acquire a little bit more tribal land. And it comes at the expense of individual trust lands. So we do see a little bit of conversion in that sense over a much longer horizon, but that's not something that we see happening in those first 4 decades. That's been a more recent phenomenon where we've seen a little bit of this transition from individual trust land to tribal trust land.
I have another minor question. Given that you don't observe, substantial differences in population levels across the IRA and non-IRA reservations, do you observe differences in the composition of the population, for example, in skill levels, educational attainment, and what type of data do you have to try to measure that over the span of the study period?
Mm-hmm. I mean, so I think the hard thing there is finding measures that we can anchor historically. And I think that's where, maybe leaning on, say, the 1940 full count can be a little bit helpful, just in, it gives us a sense of years of accumulated education. It gives us a few more characteristics that I think we can carry forward in time. Because, just to get a sense of changes in that sense. And that's just an area we haven't gotten into yet to try to understand some of those compositional differences.
Great. So please join me in thanking Dustin and Dominic and also Randy for this presentation and discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
I don't know how to clap on this webinar version. So, so why don't we follow with the next presentation by Fernando Aragon, the joint paper with Anke Kessler, both from Simon Fraser University, on custom elections and local policies in the case of Canada's First Nations. So Fernando, please take the floor.
All right, thank you, Gustavo. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. All right, can you all see the screen? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so this it's a joint project with Anke Kessler, which is also in the panelist list today. And this is our first actually take on a political economy paper on First Nations in Canada. There's been a lot of talk about the importance of governance. And there's a lot of evidence from the United States for the Harvard project, but I think quantitative studies in Canada has still been lacking a little bit. So this it's very preliminary. You'll see is just a first take on this issue. Let me see if I can. All right. So the starting point is we were looking at the different election systems in First Nation bands. Just a question: have you seen the news, the transition to the new slide? Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. So when you look at First Nations, the governance, it's mostly defined by the Indian Act, and there are 3 basic pillars of this governance system. The first one is that you have a band government, kind of that follows a little bit the template of the municipal governments in Canada. You also have elections. So the way of selecting the chief and the tribal council, it has to be done through a democratic process, but in the form of local elections. And you have a lot of oversight from the Ministry of Indian Affairs in terms of the whole process. And this governance system has been criticized by several stakeholders, First Nations and other observers, as a legacy of colonial assimilation. Some of the shortcomings that have been highlighted, it are in particular the length of the electoral cycle is usually 2 years, that many First Nations consider to be too short to do any sensible policy. The second one is an excessive intervention from the Ministry of Indian Affairs. Like literally every, the approval of the candidate list, the ratification of the votes, everything has to be done with in an interaction with Ottawa, and that was being, very cumbersome. And there were also some concerns about lack of local accountability and a very weak appeal process. So there has, given this kind of situations, many communities have really opted out of the Indian Act, and there has been several ways to do that in recent years. So, First Nations could just go into a self-government agreement, basically, creating a new governance structure outside of the Indian Act, and usually bundled together with a model treaty. But that was basically the minority. The second way and most common way to opt out of the Indian Act has been using a custom electoral system, and that's kind of the focus of this paper. So custom electoral code doesn't really revert to traditional forms of governance like hereditary chiefs. It still have to have the election, democratic election embedded, but it does tailor the code, the institutional setup to community needs. So it can go from, extending the terms of government, creation of local supervisory bodies, or local appeal bodies, even alternative nomination procedures in which they put some restrictions to whom can apply, and in the extreme, even blending of traditional governance structures, especially elder structures, with contemporary urban governments. Now, opting out is costly. You have to draft a new electoral code. You have to get approval from the majority of vote members, and finally approval by the Ministry of Indian Affairs. There is also, in recent years, a new way to out of the Indian Act, which is called the First Nations Election Act, and it's 2015. And basically it's a response of this transition to custom electoral systems. Basically what many First Nations communities and organizations did was trying to streamline a process to get a kind of custom electoral system, but without all the cost of drafting a new code. So now it's a new legislation starting in 2015 that basically creates a template for a kind of custom electoral system, which is easy to opt out. It's an off-the-shelf system that has many similarities to many custom systems, but it's simpler to apply. You just go and get a band council resolution. So this is the context we are studying. In this year, for instance, more than half the bands use custom electoral codes, 53%, 28 still remain in the Indian Act, and the rest are divided between this First Nations Election Act system and self-government agreements. So what we're going to do in this paper is look at this custom electoral system, the 50%, and see how it has affected local policies and living conditions. And this paper is basically in a straight line, it's following basically the political economy papers, thinking of this custom system as an institutional reform that potentially can change either accountability or political representation. And our first take is to look at policy outcomes. In this paper, we won't be able to kind of disentangle, what the mechanism because of data limitations, but I think it will give us a sense of the direction of the potential impact of this institutional reform. Now, similar to US, and probably it's in a more extreme case, the data availability for First Nations in Canada is very limited. There's very few information about the local policies. We're going to exploit some new release of data in 2013 and 14 that will allow us to look at some measures of band policies, in particular the remuneration of the chief as one outcome, then the budget composition, and finally some indicators of water and wastewater quality. We were going to take a look at some living conditions measures like the income of unreserved population and also conditions of dwellings. So just to grab up which will be the main findings of this paper. The first one is that when we look at this custom system, we're going to see some effects or some differences in policy outcomes. We're going to observe that bands that use custom systems pay lower remunerations to the chiefs, and they have a different budget composition. They spend more on programs labeled as education and training and less on programs which are more geared towards band development or economic development, which are mostly, job generation projects. We also observe some differences in wastewater services, but no significant difference in drinking water. So we also try to look at what happens with income and dwelling composition, and we don't observe any long-term difference in these outcomes. But we observe in the short term after the transition, after the adoption of a new custom system, we observe some deterioration, a decrease in income and an increase in dwellings in needs of major repairs. But these effects dissipate between 4 and 8 years after institutional reform. We interpret these findings as suggestive evidence that these custom electoral systems might improve local governance and gear policies towards towards projects that have a longer term impacts or potentially more bring more benefits to the local electorate, to the local population. So the data we're going to be using, it's basically based on financial statements released from in 2013 and 14, and this is very interesting because there was in the early 2010s there was this First Nation Financial Transparency Act that was trying to disclose information from the operations of local governments, of band governments. But it was a bit of an opposition. So from 2015, it was not in force. So from that year onwards, you don't have all the available information. So we're going to be using the first release of that data, what was compulsory for all First Nations, 2013 and 14. We're going to be using an assessment of water and wastewater that was done in 2009 and 2011. And that basically identified risk on the provision of water or wastewater services. We complement that with census microdata that I use, Anke and I use in previous projects, and that will give us some information of income and housing conditions for unreserved population. And finally, we collect data from public records and administrative records on the electoral systems used by First Nations communities. So when we look at local policies like the chief remuneration or the expenditure composition, we only have cross-sectional variation. We only observe these bands at one moment in time. So we're going to be basically comparing bands with custom codes, with two bands with using the Indian Act electoral system. And of course, these two bands are, widely different, and there's a lot of concerns about endogeneity in this case. So we're going to try to reduce these concerns by trying to increase comparability of the two groups. So we're going to be dropping bands who have signed model treaties or self-government agreements because they're already confounding institutional changes. We're going to also be restricting the sample to bands that by 2020, by this year, they have opted out of the Indian Act. So we will be comparing bands that use custom codes in 2011 to bands that use Indian Act in 2011, but eventually will opt out of the system, either to adopt a custom code later on or to switch to the First Nation Election Act. And again, we add a series of controls to increase comparability. So when we compare these two bands, we find that the bands that use custom system pay lower remuneration to the chief, spend more proportion of the budget on education and training and less in what is called band or economic development. And in column, when you look at column 6 and 7, we observe some decrease in the assessed risk of wastewater services. So these are the baseline results in terms of policies. We also explore other policies that, not other policies, but other indicators from the financial statements, in particular, the ratio, financial indicators like the ratio of assets to current expenditures, and we don't find anything else in there. When we look at income and housing, we have a richer data. We can use the census data, and we have a panel of bands. Plus, we have the year in which the band adopted the new system, the new electoral code. So we can use a difference in different approach, exploiting within band variation. So let me just show you the main results here. So what we do here is look at the difference by changing the year in which the band adopted the system. So 0 would be the year in which the band adopted the system. 4 is 4 years later. -4, 4 years before the adoption. So we observe that before the adoption of a custom system, there is no difference between bands with and without the custom. And years, the 4th and 8th year after, you observe a small decline, but then in years 12 and onwards, the difference disappears. This is the basis for our interpretation that these effects, if there is any effect on income, is only short-term and not permanent. Now, one interpretation of this is basically that the transition is costly in the short term, and that cannot be observed in the reduction of employment. We do the same with an indicator of housing conditions. In this case, the likelihood of living in a dwelling in need of major repairs. And we observe also marginally significant deterioration of this indicator in the year 4 years after the adoption of the reform, but again, nothing in the long term. So what do we find in this paper? It's first some evidence, I don't think it's conclusive, but it's suggestive at least, that custom electoral codes in the context of First Nations seems to affect local policies, at least the ones that we observe. There are some transitory negative effects on income and housing conditions, but they are not permanent and possibly reflecting just institutional, the cost of institutional reforms. Now, the big question is whether these results mean improvements or not in local governance, because reductions of the chief as remuneration or changes in budget composition, it's hard to interpret. It's hard to know whether this is improving voters' welfare or not. So our interpretation is leaning towards thinking of these as improvements in voters based on the reduction in risk on wastewater services and the reduction on the remuneration of the chief, which tends to look like it could be associated with some form of rent extraction. But to pin down that, we need probably more information in the future. There's also the issue that what could be driving this result. This is because of better accountability of local of band chiefs and band councils, or it's because of the change on the type of the politician running for local elections, political representation. So those are questions that we are unable at this point to address. So I think I ran out of time, so I will stop here for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Very appreciated, interesting work. So Christian, please go ahead with the discussion.
Perfect. You can all see my slide?
Yes.
So first of all, thanks a lot, Gustavo, for organizing this and for giving me and Randy the opportunity to read and discuss a couple of really great papers. So I really enjoyed the paper. going to give you a quick sort of brief on what's going on in the paper, and then I'll give a couple of comments. So the paper starts with the observation that on Canadian reserves, you have traditionally this Indian Act system, which I abbreviate IAS. So the paper doesn't use that abbreviation. I don't think it's an official abbreviation, just to keep track of things. I use the abbreviations. And so two of the main shortcomings, perceived shortcomings, anecdotal shortcomings of the Indian Act system are that the electoral cycles are short, and anyone familiar with US politics knows that, you know, congressmen getting elected every 2 years often seems kind of insane. And so correspondingly, tribal representatives being elected every 2 years seems equally insane. It certainly might lead to short-termism. And equivalently, and potentially even ironically, given the fact that you think if you're standing up for re-election more often, maybe you're more accountable, but actually the system, sort of the bundle as a whole, actually seems to lead to a lack of accountability for the politicians. So in a sense, you have the worst of both worlds. You have short-termism coupled with a lack of accountability. And so what are the alternatives? One of the primary alternative that Fernando and Anke are interested in is the custom electoral code, and the CEC abbreviation is again something that's not in the paper that I just threw in there. And so these are, as the name suggests, customized ways in which reserves/bands can choose to run their local politics. And as they explain in the paper, there's a somewhat laborious process of legally applying to obtain this status with either the provincial or the federal government in Canada. And so there's a sort of big hurdle that you need to take to get this custom electoral code system. And in 2011, 48% of reserves have taken that hurdle. And 10 years later, 53%, so almost the same share of reservations have taken that hurdle, but an additional approximately 25% of the remainder, you know, call it 51% or 47%, an additional 25%, so roughly half, have adopted this sort of easier to obtain template of the First Nations Elections Act. So easier to obtain in the sense that it is actually not customized. It is more an alternative to the IAS system that is remedies some of the shortcomings. And so that's sort of the basic setup. And then within that setup, the hypothesis or the question that Fernando and Anke are testing is, does the Indian Act system lead to short-termism and lack of accountability, which the institutional setup would, coupled perhaps with the existing literature, would suggest it does. And so they find suggestive evidence that it may. And I'm going to play devil's advocate and jump straight into some of the concerns that I had with that suggestive evidence. So there's two pieces of evidence. One is cross-sectional, one is a panel. Let me talk about the cross-sectional bit first. What you're looking at here is just kind of a distribution. So this is not a timeline. This is just partitioning the space of reserves into roughly 50%. So either 48 or 53, depending whether you're measuring it in 2010 or 2020, but let's say roughly half have this communal CEC system, communal election system. Within the space of 10 years, about a half of the remainder, so the 25%, adopt this FNEA system. So this kind of template provided to them, which puts you in this sort of halfway in between space. And then roughly 25%, I think it's a little less, remain in the kind of default Indian Act system. And so what my first comment is about is the idea of what Fernando and Anke do is they restrict their cross-sectional comparison to only comparing reserves that by 2020 had opted out of the Indian Act. So in other words, if you like, they're shaving off the 25% or maybe slightly less of reserves on the right of this distribution and only focusing on the comparison of the remainder. And the thought that I had about that, so the underlying thinking is by trimming the sample on something measurable, like do you ever opt out of the Indian Act, maybe you get more comparability, and maybe that's going to give you more of a claim to causal identification. And without taking anything away from the finding, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, I sort of found myself disagreeing with that. So my intuition was, given the fact that adopting this communal system comes with a fixed cost of applying to either the federal or provincial government to do this, I had the feeling that it requires a certain amount of local political or civic engagement on the part of the band members. It requires a certain amount of potentially civic capital or social capital to get there. And maybe the way that I want to think about these 25% of reserves that later adopted the easier to obtain FNEA, maybe these are the reserves that, like a communal system, but they didn't have the requisite civic engagement or local political mobilization to get it. And so what that would mean is, by trimming the sample like this, I'm trimming out one type of endogeneity, which is I'm trimming out the part where I have reserves that just don't want it. So those are the ones that never adopt or never opt out of the Indian Act. But I'm left with a comparison between those that were able to obtain the communal system, and those that potentially lacked the requisite amount of political engagement to do that, and then went the quote unquote easier route. And so what I was wondering about is, we're trimming the selection, but I'm not convinced that we really know that brings us closer to a causal estimate. I personally have no problem with that, because I'm thinking, if I read this result as saying, hey, look, bands that obtain this communal system, they have better outcomes, then it's almost, I would almost worry about thinking about that too much as a treatment, where I can say, hey, if I can just treat you with this, then you're good. You're going to get better accountability. You're going to get better representation. But what if the true underlying thing that's happening is really that you need the requisite amount of political engagement and social capital on the ground? It can almost be detrimental to think of this as a causal effect, because it can tempt me to think, hey, what if a social planner comes around and gives you this new set of institutions, and then all the problems are taken care of? And maybe that's not really what is going on. I'm not saying it's not. I lack the sort of on the ground knowledge to really comment on that. What I'm saying is, I'm not convinced that it is a causal estimate. And Fernando and Anke are very careful to say that they don't really have causal identification, but at the same time, they a little bit do this thing that we all tend to do, which is to say, we first flag that we're not totally that we don't have a strong claim to causal identification, but then 2 paragraphs later, we nonetheless sort of talk about it as suggesting causal identification. And so what I would recommend, so these are 2 quotes from the paper. The first one, very transparently and very openly saying, look, we don't have a lot in the cross section, we can't really make causal claims. But then 2 paragraphs later, in a sense, nonetheless saying, we interpret it as somewhat causal evidence. And so my thinking was, I would perhaps stick with this is consistent with the claim of the Indian Act system leading to short-termism and a lack of accountability. And it certainly is consistent with it. And I believe that people who know what's going on the ground will think that it might be causal. And I certainly can believe that it is, but I would keep the language a little bit more careful, partly because I think if you make it a causal statement, you sort of a little bit give this impression that we can just treat bands or treat reserves with this new set of institutions, and it will solve their problems. And I think that can be dangerous dangerous in the sense of it makes you overly optimistic on what you would achieve with that. And so I would have a preference for sticking with the more cautious wording and leaving open the possibility that maybe what we're picking up is just places with higher local political engagement give us both better institutions or on the surface better looking institutions and better outcomes. But it's still possible that what's going on in the ground is people are just more engaged. They keep closer tabs on their politicians, and that makes them act in a more, they are therefore more accountable, and that makes them act in a better way. So that's kind of my main comment. And then very quickly on the panel, that's a more technical comment. So the panel data has it's a repeated cross section with 5 waves from 1991 to 2011, so covering 2 decades. When you look at these K estimates, so from -8 to +16 around the adoption, you immediately think, well, if a bunch of reserves adopt early, they're not going to contribute at all to the K equals -8 or potentially even K equals -4 coefficient, because they will not have a K -8, K -4 if they adopt in 1992, let's say, or 1991. And then equivalently, the ones that adopt very late, they will not contribute to the +8 or +12 or +16 coefficient at all. And so what I thought might be nice for an online appendix, or just for a statement in a footnote, is to tell us how many data points are there actually in the repeat cross-section that contribute to each of these bins, because early adopters will not have a -8 or a -6 or a -4 observation. And the mirror image argument of that is late adopters will not have a +8, +12, +16 observation, and therefore not contribute to those coefficients. And so a simple way to show that would maybe be just a histogram of the number of observations in each bin. And I suspect that it probably would be bell-shaped. And you know, it is what it is. Maybe you don't go beyond that, but one thing you could consider is maybe in event studies, you often trim the end bins where you have an observation window that's wider than the event window, but maybe you just have the -8, -4 coefficient combined and the +8, +12, +16 coefficient combined. I'm not convinced you have to do that, but it would be nice to at least descriptively tell us a little bit more about how much data is there underpinning this distribution of coefficients. And then I'm ending on a very trivial note, a very minor comment. There should be a summation sign, I think, over the beta times C in the estimating equation, since you appear to be estimating, you know, these 7 beta coefficients in the regression. So that's not a very interesting comment, but it's my last comment. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Christian, and Fernando and Anke. Fernando, would you like to take a couple of minutes to respond to some of Christian's questions?
Sure. Christian, thanks a lot for the comments. I mean, I really appreciate it. Regarding the first comment about the identification concern, I completely agree, and thanks for that suggestion to qualify the language that we use, because yeah, I think we are far from any very well identified causal effect in this context. You know, we don't have a good instrument. There is no quasi-experimental variation. The best we can do is try to do a cross-section comparison. And yes, you're right. You know, what we have in mind is that we are basically trying to compare bands that kind of show willingness to adopt a new system. That was our main driver. But of course, you're highlighting the issue that we are now comparing bands that have different costs, either because of, you know, civic abilities or technical abilities to adopt a system versus the other, and that kind of still leaves this margin of potential endogeneity, and that's useful for interpretation. So yeah, we need to take care of that. In terms of the panel regressions, yeah, I need to give you the data points in each bin. I look, and it's a little bit skewed. Like a lot of things happen in the late 90s and 2000s, but yeah, it's good to provide that information in terms of the distribution of, you know, contribution of each cross section to each bin in this study. I think that study, I mean, that the main takeaway I would take, if you just run a standard diff in diff without all these time kind of this event study with only one event, like adopting or not, you get the result that there's no difference in income or housing conditions. So I think all the effort we do is just to see if there's something happening in between, and that's why we have this transitory effect. And yeah, and I needed to clarify the, I mean, the way I construct the C variables in the panel regression means that I don't, it's already, the adding up of the betas is already embedded in the construction of the variable, but maybe that wasn't clear in the paper. Yeah, so
there's actually quite a few, I'm going to interrupt you, sorry, because there's actually quite a few questions by Dominic, Randy, and Donna. So if you want to go ahead as well. Nick and Randy.
Thank you. Fernando and Anke, really interesting. Thanks for the presentation. Just a comment, really. You don't have to try to answer it. It seems like if the results are causal, then someone in the political structure is losing rents from the change to the custom electoral systems. And it might be interesting if you probe this more to think about the ex-ante lobbying or support for the change and who might be for it and who might be against it, which might also give you some corroborating evidence of how this switch would have causal effects. If the executive's pay goes down, then there might be a coalition that doesn't want the change, for example. So, thanks. Interesting paper.
Thanks.
Randy, go ahead.
Just really quickly, one thing that I always thought, in Canada specifically, that might be used as an instrument, like literally the trees are numbered, right? As you go from east to west. Like, have you thought about that? Sort of like it's sort of the exposure to the federal government, right? And like that affects the adoption of these alternative or less likely to adopt these communal or types of agreements, right? That's something I've thought for a long time. The other thing that I always thought might be instrumental and actually sort of important in the bands is sort of population size. So have you sort of thought of that as an instrument as well? Because my experience working in Treaty 8 way back when was that it was the smaller the size of the band, the more likely the factions were to be sort of purely familial based, and sort of every 2 years the pendulum would swing one direction and another direction, and that might affect sort of the types of adoption. So maybe if you could find an older population size and use that as an instrument to here.
Okay, thank you.
And Donna has a final question.
That's a good. So it's a good suggestion. I have the data, I haven't explored that outcome, but I will. And now I'm curious.
Great. So thank you very much. Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Fernando and Anka, and everyone. So now we're actually going to turn on to me. So I'm going to be presenting the paper on appropriate institutions in Oaxaca. My co-authors, Marco González Navarro from UC Berkeley and Juan Camilo Chavarro from EAFIT in Medellin in Colombia are here. If you have questions when I present, they will also be happy to answer on the chat and also in Q&A. So let me start sharing my screen. I'll try to not steal time. See if I can do that. Okay, so I've really enjoyed listening to these presentations because there are so many parallels in what we're studying. We're studying basically appropriate institutions in the context of southern Mexico and Oaxaca. And it's not just the case in North America, but also across the whole continent that indigenous communities have demanded and obtained greater autonomy over local affairs. In fact, in the context of Mexico, in 1995, the state of Oaxaca in the south legally recognized the rights of indigenous groups to use traditional governance institutions to manage local government affairs. So, quite behind what had been happening already in the US and Canada, right? Basically, the government of Mexico started recognizing this in its federal constitution in the early 90s, and at the state level, it started creating these reforms in 1995. The consequences of this reform in Mexico have been much debated. Supporters argue that, given the emphasis on the obligations of communal service, decision-making via consensus, and public participation in community assemblies, and the absence of traditional political parties actually contributes to better governance outcomes. And there's some evidence by Beatriz Magaloni, Alberto Diaz-Calleros, and co-authors suggesting that, this actually suggests that there are better, stronger public good provision in overall terms from these reforms. Critics, on the other hand, raise concerns about, deviations from standard electoral procedures that we, from a Western standpoint, would consider as important for ensuring representation, responsiveness, and accountability, such as, vote secrecy and universal enfranchisement. So Todd Eisenstadt and Juan Martinez, political scientists and sociologists, respectively, have, commented on this and documented that these are issues that we need to think about. So there's quite a bit of heterogeneity on what these custom appropriate institutions are, and it's something that something that we're gonna be thinking about in the context of Mexico. And I actually would like to pose that as a question for all of us when we're thinking about these types of reforms that are taking place across the continent. So the reform took place in 1995. The time that elapsed since there is reform and its implementation allows us now to shed light on some key questions regarding the effects of traditional governance systems in indigenous communities in the country. So I'll give you a bit of background first. So the formal recognition of traditional governance had been a core demand of indigenous communities across Mexico. In fact, the most salient was the 1994 Zapatista uprising in the state of Chiapas, just southeast of Oaxaca, that upheld this as a core demand and successfully obtained it after violent conflict and negotiations with the federal government and the state government. So the authorities in Oaxaca implemented the what's called the Usos y Costumbres reform preemptively. There were similar movements in the state of Oaxaca, and they passed this legislation and constitutional change in order partly to maintain stability and avoid unrest from indigenous communities in the state. So what the reform did, basically what happened de facto is that before the reform had taken place, the traditional governance systems were used, but in parallel, there were basically standard governance systems. There were mayoral and municipal council elections and decision-making via the traditional party system where, the PRI, the main party in power up to this point in Mexico had a lot of control over local affairs. But basically the Usos y Costumbres reforms eliminates this parallel system and constitutes basically that legitimizes that indigenous communities in the state can use their custom electoral rules and administrative practices for decision making. So it relies on community membership for leadership positions. There is this system called the cargo system, where basically people have to serve through these different echelons of public service in the community until they reach higher levels based on popularity and prestige and age and experience. So important is that municipal governments then enjoy sole decision-making authority in the allocation of many public goods and services for all residents of the municipality. And this is where it's going to be interesting, because basically how municipalities are organized in Oaxaca often host multiple distinct ethnic, ethno-linguistic communities. So according to our estimates, to our data, 277 of the state's 570 municipalities have 2 or more cohabiting indigenous groups. And this is going to represent a challenge for local representation and governance. So it's also the case, according to basically the work of Todd Eisenstadt, that in approximately 1/3 of municipalities, the residents of the outlying localities that are not the municipal capital do not have rights to vote or run for office in municipal elections. This is basically based on the first census of local governance rules of 1995. So what happens as a result of this is that the government of the community that's designated as the municipal capital enjoys this decision-making authority. And basically, it is also the case that the secret ballot is used only in 12% of these UIC municipalities. So therefore, this can limit the political representation of ethnic minorities in local affairs in basically the outlying villages and communities outside of the municipal capital. So what we're going to try to do is try to understand, what is the gradient of this degree of political representation based on this ethnic heterogeneity, and see whether this actually has consequences for public good in the Oaxaca municipality. So, to give you a bit more of a historical context, indigenous communities had historically preserved these traditional governance rules for local affairs that worked in parallel. The municipal boundaries in the state, these are outside of the scope of what we're showing in the paper, but we've done a lot of basically documenting a lot of work to understand where these boundaries were determined, and they were determined between the late 19th and early 20th centuries by Mexican state and federal authorities. These municipal boundaries encompass distinct ethnic groups, and there might be distinct communities that share these municipal boundaries. and each one of them may have their own traditional governance rules. So basically these different governance across different localities or villages across the community didn't have much of an effect until the fiscal decentralization reforms that took place in Mexico at the federal level starting in 1993. So a measure of this fiscal expenditure decentralization is that federal real transfers per capita increased by a factor of 7 between 1990 and 2000. And this gave a lot more prominence to municipal authorities in the delivery of these local public goods and services. So this basically led to more contestation, right, of who basically was going to have power over municipal resources and over the decision-making power as to how to allocate these resources for local public goods. So that's what we're going to be trying to study. First, we have data on the census of traditional governance rules and practices in UIC municipalities that were, coded by Todd Eisenstadt. From this, we can measure whether there is political enfranchisement of the outlying localities, the residents. These are what's called in the UISA system, the agencias. So we create an indicator variable for municipalities in which the residents of these outlying localities have rights to vote for office. And this is actually going to take place only in a subset of all the UISA municipalities. In 319 of these, there are 2 or more localities, the municipal capital, and then at least one outlying locality. This is basically a subset of the 418 municipalities under the regime. So we combine that with the Mexican population census data from 1990 until 2005, from which we can measure in 1990 the share of the locality level population who speak each one of the different indigenous languages spoken in the state. From that, we're going to basically construct measures of ethno-linguistic differences between municipal capitals and agencias. We also construct a locality level panel of household demographic characteristics and public goods access, in particular electrification and sewerage rates, and some outcomes of children's literacy rates. So our measure of ethnic heterogeneity is basically a Euclidean norm of the difference in basically the vector of the shares of the localities in which each, of each ethno-linguistic group in 1990 as compared to the analogous vector for the residents of the municipal capital. We have an analogous measure for municipal capital residents, which we don't actually employ much in the paper, but we'll do so in future. So just to give you a sense of how much overlap there is in terms of these ethno-linguistic differences, only 6% of outlying localities are perfectly co-ethnic with municipal capital residents in the UISA municipalities. So there's quite a bit of variation in the degree to which there is ethno-linguistic differences. I'm going to skip some of these summary stats for the sake of time. The other thing we do is that we have access to the Ministry of Public Education public school census data collected annually from 1990 until 2002. This allows us to measure the location and characteristics of each primary and secondary public school in the state. So we can assign each one of the secondary schools to a locality level, to a village, and we construct an indicator variable for the presence of a secondary school in each locality per year. And just to get a sense of kind of, the degree to which there's full access, 10% of the outlying localities have access to a secondary school in their locality throughout this period. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm gonna show you basically that there is a negative correlation between the ethno-linguistic differences between the outlying localities and the municipal capital. We're going to do that using this empirical model where we have an indicator variable for whether there's enfranchisement of the outlying locality residents as a function of whether they are more ethno-linguistically distinct to the residents of the municipal capital. We're going to control for the population of each locality and for municipality fixed effects. So all of this analysis is done within municipality comparisons. So let me show you, how the graph represents this pattern in the data. So basically, what we see is, as one would expect from many economic theories, is political economic theories, is that we see a negative relationship, right, between how distinct these outlying localities are and the likelihood that they have political representation. This outcome represents basically that, you know, relative to co-ethnic localities, those with the average level of ethno-linguistic difference to the capital are 4 percentage points approximately less likely to be enfranchised than those that are fully co-ethnic with the municipal capital. And the final thing that we do in the paper is to document, okay, given that there is perhaps this more limited degree of representation in municipal affairs, what consequences does this have for public goods provision? So we're going to do this in a panel regression, where we'll basically be measuring the correlation of these public good measures, electrification rates, sewerage rates, and middle school access. We're going to basically see whether these are correlated with the degree of ethno-linguistic difference in the pre-reform period. That's going to give us like a balance test. The theta 1 is going to capture some type of, you know, balance test of whether there are differences pre-reform. And then we're also going to interact the measure of ethno-linguistic difference with the post-reform period to basically see whether there is a change in the gradient of ethnic heterogeneity or polarization and public goods provision, controlling for municipality fixed effects, population size, and time fixed effects. So these are the main results. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to be very brief. Basically, we basically find these are the estimates of theta 1. There is no significant difference basically in pre-reform access to primary public goods, electrification rates, sewerage rates, and secondary schools. And we do see some you know, mixed evidence of changes in the access to these public goods post-reform. So basically, outlying localities that are more distinct have less access to electrification in the post-reform period. On the other hand, they're actually more likely to catch up and have significantly more access to sewerage and to middle school, secondary schools than those that seem to be more co-ethnic with the municipal capital. I'm going to skip some of the discussion of magnitudes that we can get to after Christian's discussion. And just finish with a brief conclusion, right? There is this growing debate of this role of mixed governance reforms and of the UISA system in particular for democracy, socioeconomic development, and conflicts. We document that the reform legitimizes the exclusion of minorities from traditional mechanisms of municipal decision-making following these ethno-linguistic gradients. However, we have some cautious optimism regarding the reform's welfare implications, as minority groups within the UISA municipalities seem to have gained formal recognition in local affairs more recently, and still also seem to gain, more access to public goods than those that are more collective. And with that, I stop and give the floor to Christian for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gustavo. Can you see my slides? Okay, perfect. So let me delve right into it. So I really liked the premise of the paper because it resonates really with a large political economy literature overall. Sorry, I'm having a minor technical hiccup here on my end. Bear with me for a second. Okay, I'll just live with it. I've got a funny thing in the middle of my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, never mind. So the basic premise or the basic setup is you have a decentralization of political decision making from the center, in this case the center of Mexico, to the municipality M. And the concern is, or the sort of like what the anecdotal evidence suggests might happen, is that you actually have this sort of shifting of balance, almost like a tyranny of the majority type thing, where the local majority, the local dominant ethnic group, if you like, or at least the ethnic group that dominates the center of the municipality, might actually disenfranchise or in other ways potentially marginalize indigenous ethnic groups that live in the same municipality but in the periphery. And so LC is the nomenclature or the notation used by Gustavo and his co-authors for the locality in the center, and then LP is not actually something in the paper, but it'd be the equivalent of a locality in the periphery in the same municipality. And so the channel that they're interested in is, if we give more decentralized power to the municipality, so a more federalist system, if you like, could it be that whichever ethnic group dominates the locality in the center, the L subscript C, might disenfranchise or otherwise marginalize a non-co-ethnic locality P, peripheral locality? And so that's going to be, in the if statement, that's going to be more likely to occur, or potentially just be more pronounced at the continuous margin, if that peripheral locality is less co-ethnic, in some sense less similar than what's in the center of the municipality. These are the two main estimating equations. The outcome looks the same in the two equations, but it's something different. So in equation 2, we have the question of, is a non-central, so peripheral locality, more likely to be disenfranchised in the sense that they play no role in what happens in the center of the municipality, if they are more distant to the ethnic composition of the center? So that's the ELD measure. I've just rewritten the ELD measure as a vector norm, L subscript P minus L subscript C in the first bullet, but that's the idea. So you're asking, is the periphery in the municipality more likely to get disenfranchised? And they find evidence that is the case if they're less co-ethnic. And then the second estimating equation is equation 3, which is asking, does this distance, so ethnic distance, then have an effect on public good provision before and after the reform? So pre and post denotes pre and post 1995, when you have this decentralization to the municipality. One minor suggestion I had about this is it would feel very natural to rerun this equation 3 with instead of using ELD, actually using the outcome from equation 2. So asking, are you disenfranchised, yes or no? And then what effect does that have? And obviously these ARPP papers are very short, so you can't have another table, but just a footnote on saying what happens if we replace that margin of variation, I thought would be very natural and very, very interesting, in fact, to ask that. So that's a more minor comment. My major comment is on this slide. So this is a snapshot of the key table. And so the key table shows you that when you compare a locality that is less co-ethnic with the center of a municipality, before and after the reform that gave more decentralized power to the municipality, you see this switch in public good provision in the periphery of the municipality relative to the center before and after. And so that's, but the switch isn't always going in the same direction. So for one public good, which is electrification, you have the switch turning negative. For another public good, you have it turn positive. So what we see is stuff changes, but it doesn't change necessarily in a way where we can say public good provision is getting worse across the board, or public good provision is, which would be potentially the prediction of a stylized model, or it's getting better across the board. We can't say either. It's a mix. So there's changes happening, but it's a mixed bag. Gustavo and his co-authors sort of conclude with the statement that this is consistent with changes in the responsiveness of municipal government to the needs of these peripheral outlying communities in the municipalities that are given more power. I was thinking it might be consistent with that, but when I look at the table, nothing in the paper tells me anything about what these local peripheral communities want. So if you tell me that the peripheral community wants more electrification and less sewerage, I would conclude that maybe the center is becoming less responsive to them. If you tell me that the outlying locations want less electrification and would rather have better connection to the sewage system, I would conclude that the center is becoming more responsive to them. And if you tell me that the outlying communities really don't care either way, or their preferences don't change, then maybe I need to conclude that this is just some budgetary mechanism that speaks to the internal political economy of the municipality, but maybe it doesn't have anything to do with the responsiveness to what's on the outside. And so it's a natural limitation to, at least from what I could tell in the paper, at least at this point, maybe not actually being able to measure anything about the potential changes in revealed preferences of the outlying peripheral communities. But given that we see nothing on what the peripheral localities want or changes in what they want, it's sort of difficult to know that we can see the changes, but I don't know whether we can say much about responsiveness. And I would suggest maybe just being a little bit clearer on that limitation, and maybe it can be overcome, but sort of for now, maybe being a little bit clearer that it might be that, but it might also be other things. Overall, on the process, section 1 of the paper describes these margins of variation in local institutions, but it's mostly described as just a margin of variation and not the decision-making process that actually underlies equation 2. And so I think the paper could really benefit from a slightly modified explanation in section 1 on how is this decision actually being made. So it's described purely as a margin of variation, but at the same time there's an underlying decision-making process, but it's not really discussed in the paper at the moment. And I sort of ended up not really being sure who's making that decision in the first place. And then there's also a little bit of a tension where the section starts with describing some indigenous governance rules on making decisions communally and without parties that seemed very intuitive to me. But then it delves into these results of this 1995 census. And I was pretty unclear on how these two things relate to one another. So whether what's measured in the census is actually about these tribal governance rules. And if so, who put that into writing and how was that formalized? A couple of sentences on that process, I think, would really help, even within this very sort of limited, size that you have in the paper. And then lastly, Gustavo, you already alluded to the fact that you are barely actually using panel B of table 1. On top of, and so I didn't really see it be used at all in the paper, and so I was slightly confused about that. And on top of that, I also just didn't understand what it was. The way I read it, I thought these measures all needed to be 0 in panel B, and so it might be best to just chuck it. And then very minor, on the first page, it's talking about 400 out of 570 municipalities having adopting these rules. But then in the table, we have 319 out of 454. That's not really explained. I'm sure there is an explanation, but it's, I think, currently missing. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Christian. I will only take a minute. I won't respond to everything. I appreciate all these comments and I agree with all of them. And we'll address these. One point that I wanted to make regarding basically the preferences of peripheral localities relative to municipal capitals that are more or less co-ethnic is it's true that we don't know what these preferences are. If anything, in a model in which we don't include municipal fixed effects, if anything, what we see is that peripheral localities have before the reform, they have more access to electricity than more co-ethnic outlying localities, and actually have less access to sewerage than more co-ethnic outlying localities. So if we assume that outlying localities have just preferences for more of all, then what we're saying is that yes, they're actually catching up relative to the more co-ethnic ones that actually seem to have more. So that's something that we should actually highlight in the paper, because it's at least consistent with the fact that the municipal government is responding to where the gaps were and where was a surplus relative to more co-ethnic localities. But yeah, we'll think about how to address all of these in the paper. Thank you very much. I want to make sure that we have enough time for the last presentation, so I'm actually going to skip additional questions so that Brian can actually have his full time to present. So thank you very much for the comments. And Brian, I'll now leave you with the floor.
All right. Thanks, Gustavo, and thanks again for organizing the session. And thanks in advance to Randy for his comments. Let me pull my screen up here. Okay, great. So can everybody see that? We good? Okay. So this is joint work with Christian and then also with Donna Fair and with Mark Rourke, who's a legal scholar and is really responsible for creating the data that allow us to sort of categorize treatment for this paper. So in the background there, you're looking at the Navajo Blue Travel Plaza, which opened this year, unfortunately in the middle of COVID-19, but this is a brand new tribal enterprise on the Navajo Nation, really with the goal of trying to pull in some economic activity that would usually happen off the reservation, i.e. people stopping for gas in the middle of northern Arizona on their way to the Grand Canyon or their way to Lake Powell, and bring that economic activity onto the reservation. And that's really what we want to try to understand both in this paper and in kind of in our future work, and think about the role that secured transactions laws potentially play in facilitating this kind of development. So for a little bit of background, oops, there we go. In general, we want to think about what is a uniform commercial code. And so if you think about uniform commercial codes, the Uniform Law Commission was formed in the US kind of at the end of the 19th century to try to harmonize the way that commercial transactions are governed across the United States, really to lower transaction costs and make it easier for commercial, like, sort of large scale commerce to occur across states. The Uniform Commercial Code as it exists today was first published in the 1950s and has sort of been adapted subsequently. What we're really going to focus in on is Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code, which is the governance of secured transactions, or referred to as secured transactions laws. So what a secured transactions law does is it creates an encumbrance on personal property to support debt obligations. And importantly, it provides a centralized registry of those debt obligations. So this is, if I want to, leverage some sort of property that I own as collateral for a loan, it creates a standardized process for doing that. And importantly, a standardized registry where somebody can go look up, if I'm trying to get a loan from someone, you can go look up and see if I've already leveraged that property to somebody else. So that's the way secure transactions laws work in general. And within the context of the Uniform Commercial Code, the goal is to make that sort of system as similar as possible across states so that a lender can operate in different jurisdictions and kind of know what's going on. Where this gets complicated for reservations is that generally tribes have the authority to enforce their own civil laws, which means that in general, kind of the default is that state commercial codes are not going to apply on the reservation. So what that's meant in practice is that a lot of financial institutions are often going to be hesitant to lend on reservations, because when you go on the reservation, you're kind of going to run into one of three things in terms of secured transactions laws. One, there might not even be one. And to the extent that there is one, it might be kind of unclear, or at the very least, it might be unfamiliar to these large lending institutions that are used to dealing with states' UCCs. So because of that, over the past several decades, the Uniform Law Commission has gotten together with both the Federal Reserve and with tribal leaders to try to minimize these differences that exist between tribes, between regions, and sort of between, a given reservation and the state that it happens to be in. So again, the idea behind these laws is to kind of make things as uniform as possible to lower transaction costs. But when we think about doing that on reservations, we're going to run into some challenges. One is just that sort of a wholesale uniform adoption of the secured transactions law might displace or modify tribal norms and values related both to the ownership of property and to debt obligations between different parties generally. And this is something that kind of motivated the Uniform Law Commission to reach out to tribal leaders and work with them. The other challenge here, of course, right, is that any sort of dealing between tribes and the US government and even with state governments is going to carry a lot of historical baggage. And so just wholesale adopting these uniform texts that have been written by some external government might prove problematic for some reservations. So those tensions are going to, in practice, be reflected in typically one of two ways when a tribe is still trying to get the benefits of having these secure transactions law. The first thing a tribe might do is they might selectively adopt a uniform or template law and be selective in either who the law applies to or in what types of transactions it applies to. The other thing they might do is that they might use a local filing system for those debt obligations rather than just kind of plugging their system into the state filing system. And that's going to give them more control over which debt obligations have priority when there's multiple debt obligations on a single piece of property. So what we want to do in this paper is we want to try to understand how does the adoption of one of these secured transactions laws affect economic activity on reservations? And in particular, can we parse out the different kind of selective adoptions that are occurring and think about potential trade-offs between these carve-outs for sort of cultural sovereignty for reservations and the potential economic benefits of having a more uniform law? So to do that, we're really going to rely on Mark's work. So what Mark has done is he's sat down and read through almost all 71 of these secured transactions laws that have been adopted by a reservation and categorized them. There's like 9 or 10 that sort of were unavailable, so we're not able to categorize them. But the way these break down is there's something called the Model Tribal Secured Transactions Act, which was drafted by the ULC in consultation with tribes. There's also just kind of the straight up Uniform Law Commission, their Uniform Commercial Code. And then there's sort of state specific adoptions of that Uniform Commercial Code. And then there's what we call non-uniform laws, which is basically you wrote your own law. So that's kind of the broad universe of ways this could go down. Those are the different texts that a tribe might be adopting. And sort of holding that constant, we're going to parse those adoptions along 2 key dimensions. One is going to be, how did you adopt a text? Did you adopt it uniformly? That is to say, did you just take the MTSTA, or did you take your state's uniform law, whatever law it is, did you just take it as written? Or did you adopt it selectively and kind of create potential carve-outs? So that's going to be dimension 1. And then dimension 2 is, are you using the state filing system, or are you using the local filing system? And then, of course, the kind of catch-all category, or the other category, is you might write your own law and you may not use a filing system. So in fact, that creates more categories than these 5 that I've shown you here, but these are the 5 that we actually see in the data. We see uniform or selective adoption of a text with a state filing system, uniform or selective adoption of a text with a local filing system, and then in practice, the folks that have a non-uniform adoption and kind of write their own text don't have kind of an organized filing system at all. So those are the 5 kind of categories we're going to parse the data into. I want to say a little bit more about what it means to selectively adopt a law, just because that's going to be pretty important in interpreting our results. So in total, we have 22 tribes that adopt some uniform text, but do so selectively. In practice, what that means is that some of these tribes are limiting the application of the law specifically to tribal parties, tribal enterprises, or tribal property. So in the example from the Navajo Nation gas station, that is a tribal enterprise, so the law would definitely apply to them even under this type of selective adoption. Another 6 tribes have limited the application only to sales of accounts or chattel paper. I'll let Mark answer questions about that at the end. One of these tribes specified that the law doesn't apply to consumer transactions, and 4 of the tribes have created additional limits on specifically on kind of what creditors can do to seek remedies. So that's kind of what we mean by a selective adoption. Here's what that looks like kind of in the data over time. You're just looking at the total number of reservations that have adopted each type of law over time. So one of the kind of stylized facts that comes out of this figure is that the early adoptions seem to be more of the selective adoption with a local filing system or a non-uniform adoption, that kind of variety. Whereas more recently, there's been a trend in movement towards more uniform adoption and utilization of state filing systems. But this is really, again, this is kind of Mark's work in reading all of these things by hand and categorizing them. And then this is going to basically be our identifying variation to do kind of a generalized diff and diff 2-way fixed effect setup, which is what we're going to talk about on this slide. So yeah, we're just going to do kind of a standard generalized difference and difference, where we're going to allow there to be a separate treatment effect for each type of adoption. And then we're going to try to have pretty flexible controls, both for unobserved heterogeneity, both in space and in time. So the data to do that are going to be, the graph I just showed you of adoptions by year, which come from Mark. And then to look at outcomes, what we've done is we've created a panel of nighttime lights from 1992 to 2013 at the square mile resolution. And so what we're doing in kind of this particular paper for the sort of short papers, we're just going to look at what happens on reservations. Our future work is going to look at what happens on reservations relative to off reservation and really think about the spatial distribution of economic activity, which is part of why we're doing this kind of high resolution look at what's going on. So to unpack that a little bit more, what's nice about the night lights is they let us look at economic activity at a very fine spatial resolution, and they're also going to let us look at economic activity at a relatively fine temporal resolution. As many of you know, if we're trying to look at economic outcomes on reservations, it can be hard to get anything better than sort of like a reservation by census decade observation. Or you might be able to put together something really detailed for a particular reservation. And so using the night lights is going to let us have this high resolution data set, both in space and time, across the universe of reservations, which we think is really nice. In terms of drilling down to using kind of a square mile as the unit of observation, as opposed to using like a reservation average of nightlights, this is going to let us look at the intensive margin versus the extensive margin of economic activity. So are we seeing, you know, the lights get brighter in a town where there's already development, or are we seeing new development in places that weren't, you know, previously developed? And it's going to turn out that's pretty important. It's going to let us use kind of spatial fixed effects to control for large swaths of many reservations, particularly in the Western US, where you just wouldn't ever see development. Whereas if we use kind of a reservation level average, that's going to get pulled into that average. And then finally, as I've said, this is kind of forming the baseline for some future work where we actually really want to model those spatial dynamics pretty explicitly. So that's kind of the real reason. So here's just kind of a look at what we're doing, an example from the Flathead Reservation in 1993 versus 2013. Those little green squares are going to be our unit of observation. And then you're looking at the night lights. And if you kind of squint at it, you can see that, you know, the lights are brighter kind of in the urban areas that were already lit, i.e. they're more white than they were in 1993. And we have a lot of new areas becoming lit that weren't lit in 1993. So those are the two margins of variation we really want to look at. To do that, we're just going to have this pretty flexible two-way fixed effects estimator, where we're just going to have basically a separate treatment dummy for each of the 5 types of adoptions that turns on in the year in which you adopt and stays on after that. We're going to look at 3 different outcomes. We're going to look at the inverse hyperbolic sine of night lights in a section, which is going to combine both the intensive and extensive margin. We're going to look at a dummy variable for whether there's any lights in a section. That's going to tell us about the extensive margin. And then we're going to look at the log of lights in places that always have light, which is going to tell us about the intensive margin. We're going to use sort of 2 specifications here. One is going to be sort of the standard diff and diff baseline, where we're going to have reservation fixed effects and year fixed effects. And then we're going to introduce a more flexible specification where we actually use township fixed effects, which is a 6 by 6 mile square, so that you can think about that as being a pretty flexible spatial fixed effect to absorb unobserved heterogeneity in space. And then we're going to use state by year fixed effects to try to absorb sort of differential changes in economic activity across different regions across time. So that's kind of the basic setup. Here's what we find. I've only got 1 table for you to stare at, and I'm actually going to condense this into another table. But basically what we find when we look at these uniform adoptions that utilize the state filing system, that's really going to have an effect on the intensive margin. So places where there's already activity going on are going to get brighter, but it's not doing anything to turn on the lights in kind of areas that don't have economic activity already. If you selectively adopt a law and use the state filing system, we're going to see increases in economic activity at both margins. So the IHS and the log columns, of course, are interpretable as percentage changes. These middle columns are percentage point changes that correspond to like a 30 to 50% change relative to the mean in terms of the probability of a section being lit. We see very little for category 3, so I'm not going to talk about it. And then for category 4, if you selectively adopt a law and use your own local filing system, we see changes primarily at the extensive margin. That is, we see new development in areas that were previously unlit, but little evidence of areas that already had economic activity becoming brighter. So to kind of summarize all of that, what we see is that if you have a selective adoption, you get sort of benefits regardless of what filing system you use. If you use a local filing system, it looks like that's mostly going to be generating sort of new development or development in areas that weren't previously developed. Whereas if you use a state filing system, you're going to get development on both margins. And then in contrast with the uniform adoption, we really only see any benefits of those uniform adoptions when a state filing system is utilized. So we think what this is saying, or kind of our interpretation of this, is that those filing systems are really important for minimizing transaction costs for outside lenders. I got to know kind of how to use the filing system for it to be useful. And that these selective adoptions are what's potentially allowing tribes to kind of steer economic activity maybe towards tribal enterprises as opposed to kind of outside, outside businesses coming in. So kind of the upshot of that is it sort of looks like, having a selective adoption of a text that allows you to create the carve-outs you want to create, but then utilizing the state filing system that makes things a little bit more streamlined and uniformed for these outside financiers might be kind of a win-win and kind of be the best of both worlds for tribes. So I'll basically stop there, but just say that in future work, kind of in a longer paper, what we'd like to do is bring in some alternative outcome measures to better understand kind of what these changes in night lights actually mean on the ground. And then, as I said, really want to unpack kind of the spatial distribution of economic activity and see if these laws are helping to kind of pull in economic activity that was previously kind of right on the border of the reservation. But I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very interesting talk. Randy, now it's your turn to discuss it.
Great. Can you guys see everything? Great. So, so yeah, the question here is, does the adoption of secure transactions laws affect economic development for reservations? And as Brian noted, there's one of the biggest difficulties in this area is getting useful measures of outcome. And so this nighttime light series data, the sort of application of it is a novel contribution and quite intriguing. And it's been used in developing countries to measure economic growth, where again, measures are lacking. And their findings are that the adoption of STL in its various forms, and he's just shown have different configurations of them, are associated with increased nighttime lights. And the idea here, the theory there is that it makes lending, borrowing, transactions more feasible and increases economic development on reservation lands. And there's some extensive and intensive margin results. And depending on the type of STL adopted, the on-reservation lights increase somewhere between 10 to 53% in their different specifications. And so some of the questions I have that, and I, again, acknowledging that this is a short paper, but what do you think nighttime lights measure in this context? In the developing country context, it's often a proxy for economic development and or political development. And I think in this particular case, you're just sort of narrowing it just to economic development. But I think, you premised the very first slide sort of the Navajo Nation's sort of state-owned enterprise activities there. So I think you really want to make a distinction between entrepreneurship by individuals and state-owned enterprises on these nighttime lights, because there's no distinction in the paper there. As somebody reading this, you're thinking about the way it's framed as entrepreneurship, but I think maybe you're thinking about sort of political and government development as well. And so again, specifically, what are these nighttime lights? Are they street lights? Are they from residential homes, or are they from business and commercial enterprises? And it matters because entrepreneurs, as reading the paper, don't have anything to do with erecting street lights or or even housing, right? So that's going to be sort of, I think, important to distinguish between. And I was kind of surprised that you weren't controlling for other potential policy changes. At the very end, your last slide there, you mentioned that you'd like to have casinos and gaming as an outcome variable, but really I think that needs to be a control variable there, because that's sort of the elephant in the room. American Indian gaming started in this exact same time period from 92 to 23. And you have state by year fixed effects, but that won't capture the start of gaming activities for these different tribes because there are multiple tribes within states. So, I think you have an important omitted variable there that, you really need to sort of include as to show the robustness of your outcomes hold up in the face of this. And this is particularly important because IGRA was established to increase revenues for tribal governments for operations and specifically infrastructure development, right? Roads, streets, housing, and that might actually be the thing you're measuring here. So again, I think that specifying that is going to be important. And it's not feasible to think that, well, the entrepreneurship or the revenues generated from businesses will be sort of come through tribal government revenues through something like reservations. So again, I think that you're thinking through state-owned enterprises, tribally owned enterprises, which is not mentioned in the paper, would be useful. And then also, what proportion of the nighttime lights are due to reservation jurisdictions versus non-Indian lands within the reservation boundaries, right? We all know from allotment that the loss of reservation lands at the individual tribal level affected jurisdiction and ownership of lands on the reservations. So, this is Palm Springs, California, not far from where I live. These are 1 mile square blocks. The enclosed blocks are part of the reservation. The open blocks are part of Palm Springs, California. And you use townships as a measure of 6 by 6, 6 miles by 6 miles, and in that measure, half the lights come from the city of the reservation. And so, specifying a little bit about that is going to matter. You mentioned in the presentation that you actually have 1 mile by 1 mile units that you can look at, but in the paper you mentioned that you're using these townships, which are 6 miles. So maybe you want to sort of disaggregate even further in your empirical specification, actually. And this also has implications for the different types of regressions that you run. You have some specifications where you include a township fixed effect and others where you have a reservation fixed effect. And so that will actually be collinear in some of these cases, like Palm Springs, for instance. And actually that might be an issue where reservations are relatively small. And that might be an issue for California tribes, a number of New England tribes, and probably a bunch of Pueblos. So I asked that because, then the difference between the R and the T columns in your regression results, probably aren't getting you nearly as much. And then given that size matters, how sensitive are these analyses to dropping Navajo, right? That's, again, the elephant in the room. And then you also don't talk about Oklahoma. And I asked that specifically because in the Rourke article, there are a number of Oklahoma tribes that are mentioned as adopting secure transaction clause. And clearly the issue being that, the McGirt recent decision notwithstanding, these aren't reservation lands. Just a minor thing, that figure 1, which is the figure you just showed, Brian, in 2013, if you count the sort of vertical line there, only 29 adoptions of STL and not the 62 as you note in the text. So maybe you are dropping Oklahoma already, and maybe you are dropping some other states, but it would be helpful to sort of understand why there's that discrepancy there. And then finally, the use of the term culturally appropriate in your title, I don't think really captures what it is that you guys are doing. When others have sort of looked at cultural appropriate, cultural match and that stuff, it's always been sort of a match between existing political institutions and some sort of pre-contact, at least, anthropologists determined pre-contact culture. I have problems with that anyway, because, by the time an anthropologist has got out there to measure your culture, you've already been impacted by war, disease, and relocation, but whatever. So, but you guys aren't doing that here. You're just looking at, you're not doing any comparisons across cultural institutions or time. What you're looking at is sort of the choice of current politicians to adopt a type of secure transactions laws. And I think that's more appropriately termed, self-governance and not cultural appropriateness, because you're not really evaluating that. And we're not anthropologists as well, so, So anyway, as a conclusion, you have this increase in night lights by 10 to 53%. It does seem quite large. And so, I'd be much more confident to see a direct control for casino operations, the start of casino operation over this time period, and to see those results hold up. Another thing that would be really interesting to see is if you could disaggregate your results by years after STL adoption. Really, do you see a bump up in night lights 1 year after adoption, or does it come with a lag? I would anticipate it would come with a lag, but that would be something to be able to show, and I think you should be able to do that given you have multiple years here. And I commend you for this, neat use of nighttime lights. It's a potentially, very, very useful outcome measure. Another way in which I thought that you might want to sort of utilize the adoption of STL, and again, of just is the use of the ILBD. I've done some work with Dick Todd and Elton Micarezzi, and we've actually coded those data sets with reservation locations. So, those things that you could use directly. You have to go through the RDCs and stuff like that, but that seems to me would be much more sort of in line with the direct impact of STL on outcomes that are closely related to it. So that's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian and team, and to Randy for this excellent discussion. Brian, would you like to take some minutes to respond to Randy's comments?
I mean, in general, I just want to say thanks for all the thoughtful comments. I really appreciate it. Just to clarify a couple of really big picture things. One is that we do just exclude Oklahoma across the board. And the reason is that there's a lot of variation among the OTSAs in whether the state code applies or the tribe actually has jurisdiction. And in particular, looking forward at the long paper where we want to look on versus off reservation, it becomes really murky to try to do that when they're all adjacent to one another, and some of them have jurisdiction and some don't. So we've just excluded it from the analysis for now. So I think that was kind of the big thing that I wanted to clarify. But yeah, the gaming in particular is a really important one to look at, and we're gonna have to think about that and see what it does. But I really appreciate the comments, super helpful.
Excellent, thank you. So Richard Todd in the audience has a number of questions that I was wondering whether whether Brian or Christian or Donna would like to, or Mark would like to address. And if you want to review them, in the meantime, Nick actually has also a question that he would like to raise. Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, thanks. Very interesting paper. Thank you. I'm just wondering if the laws might be preconditions for certain kinds of contracts or commercial transactions. And if so, is there some kind of latent or pent up demand that is, I don't know, triggered by the passage of the law? And if so, that might mean you want to think about omitting the periods of time preceding the passage of the law. In other words, is it possible that some of the transactions that appear to result from the passage of the law are just being displaced in time? Because there could be a transaction that's going to happen or might happen, and conditional on that, it might make sense for the lender or the transaction to be delayed in time. So you might want to drop those years that precede the passage of the law.
Yeah, I guess one thing I would say about that quickly, and this reminds me one of Randy's other comments, we've sort of played around with looking at this in an event study framework. And to your point, Nick, it's really flat in the pre-period. So you don't see, it doesn't appear to be that there's like substitution over time in the sense that there's fewer transactions before and then it jumps up. Like it's pretty flat. And then to Randy's question, in the post period, what you see, I mean, and it kind of makes sense because it's, we're talking about big capital investments. It's not something that's going to turn on like that. And so you see kind of this gradual increase after the passage of a law that gets bigger and bigger over time. You don't see this big discontinuity, which I think makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't make for the prettiest event study graph.
So Kelly from support is letting me know that we have 1 minute left. Before any final questions, I just wanted to thank all the panelists and also to Randy and Christian for excellent discussions of all the papers. It's been a pleasure to have you all here, and I look forward. It's been great because I don't think all of us perhaps have interacted with each other in the past. So I think it's been a great session to learn about what's happening and to make comparisons about what's going on across the different settings in the continent. So I look forward to engaging more with you in the future. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the day.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.